Welcome. Thank you for joining us. It is the end of April 2018 as we do this recording. And I want to thank you for joining this virtual conversation on awakened activism. My name is Margit Bantowsky, and I am the founder and creator of awakenedactivism.net. And it is my joy and privilege to facilitate today's discussion, where we're going to explore, what we mean by awakening, how it affects our ability to do activism and respond to the suffering that we see in the world around us. I'll give you a little background about myself. My undergraduate degree is in chemical engineering, and I spent nearly 2 decades working really hard to reduce the amount of toxics that Washington manufacturers released into the environment. And it became obvious to me that science alone wasn't going to affect the changes that we needed for a healthy long-term relationship between humans and our living earth. And even my graduate studies in psychology seemed to fall a little short somehow. And it wasn't until 2011 when I encountered the transformative psycho-spiritual work that's now called Trillium Awakening that I finally sensed that I'd found like this essential key to unlocking the kind of capacities and human maturity needed to address the vast myriad and complex crises currently facing the earth and her inhabitants. And I loved the Trillium work so much, I eventually became an interning teacher in 2016. And this awakened activism work represents sort of a ripening and integration of my environmental and social and psycho-spiritual passions and work and studies. So with me today are 2 brilliant and gifted friends and colleagues, some of my favorite people on this planet, who have generously set aside some time in their very busy lives to join me in this important conversation. So I'm going to start by introducing you to Dr. Leticia Nieto. I have known Leticia for over 20 years now, and I'm really happy that our paths are really winding together a lot more now these days. Leticia has been a core professor in the Master's in Counseling Psychology program in St. Martin's University, many, many years. She's the lead author of the excellent book called Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment, a developmental strategy to liberate everyone. And Leticia is a much sought after keynote speaker and trainer of the Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment anti-oppression model. She's also a licensed psychotherapist in private practice. She's a trainer, educator, and practitioner of psychodrama, and is skilled in many expressive techniques. And she also has been a realized practitioner of the Trillium Path since 2012. Welcome, Leticia.
Thanks, Margit.
Thank you. Another dear friend and respected colleague who I've known for 18 years is Kirstin Eventyr. Kirstin is the owner and lead teacher at Awakening to Wholeness, the School of Embodied Energetics in Olympia, Washington. Kirstin has been a spiritual counselor for over 25 years in private practice. She got involved in the Trillium Awakening work in 2011, same year as I did, and is a mentor in the work. Kirstin is fascinated in the confluence of embodied spirituality and awakened activism. And while she doesn't know all the answers, exploring these questions is a deep passion of hers. So welcome, Kirstin.
Thank you so much, Margit. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation.
I'm glad you're here. So I thought it might be helpful to start with like the basic question, like what does awakened activism mean to you? Like, how does it live in you? What does it mean? How would you express it? Does either one of you want to go first? Leticia?
Awakened activism to me is a natural product or sort of outcome of maturation. And it's my primary discipline is human development, so I understand human development, particularly adult development, as relating to deepening and widening beyond self and beyond the definitions of one's own group identifications to that which is broader. And so awakened activism to me is the hand-in-hand quality of coming to know oneself as much larger than a single identity, and acting accordingly.
Thank you. Kirstin, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. Yeah, for me, awakened activism is that aspect of being that simultaneously recognizes itself as one and the same with all of creation. And as a result, caring very deeply for all of it. And simultaneously being able to deeply trust that, trust what is unfolding, to trust what is, not as a spiritual bypass to not take action, but as a recognition within my own being that allows me to orient from a place that is more restful, that is more trusting and less fearful, and come to the table with my gifts and skills, rather than approaching from a place of emergency reactivity.
Thank you. I feel the steadiness of that, and appreciate this concept of reactivity, and how this awakened activism somehow isn't fueled by that. And I'm wondering, Leticia, if you would want to add something about like why this is a developmental thing, like the reactivity and the developmental piece. Does that make sense? I imagine you have something to speak there.
Right. So one of the definitions of maturity is the ability to respond instead of react. And so the capacity to not have our own personal wounding, whether it be from our own narrative, from our own lived experience, through generational and historical trauma, through spiritual reality, not have the wounding be that which guides us and gets projected on our life path and other people, but rather actually being able to have encounter. In psychodrama, we have this idea that everything we do in life, really, but also everything we do as part of our work as socionomists and psychodramatists and sociodramatists and stuff, is to promote and create the conditions for encounter, for true encounter. And that's when there's a true meeting of two, and those two don't have to necessarily be human beings, but the meeting of any entity with another entity, which almost immediately results in at least some measure of recognition of oneness. So that that's where my mind went.
Thank you. Kirstin, you want to add to that?
Boy, I think you just said that so well, Leticia. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, I appreciate that the real encounter and what a workout that is. And so that kind of brings me to another angle on this, like, what do we mean by awakening? Because you could have a spiritual awakening that recognize the unified nature of all life, the non-separate, unified embeddedness that we are into the matrix of the whole thing. And yet that awakening doesn't necessarily guarantee that we're going to mature around our reactivity. And so there's that necessity of continuing to do, what we call the shadow work of encountering our own wounding and integrating it so that we can really be with the other much more openly and vulnerably and directly.
Yeah. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, I so appreciate you saying that, Margit. I feel that part of the gift of awakening for me has been a resiliency to stay with the pieces that are painful within my own being, within who I am, and have the ballast to work with those pieces and encounter them and be revealed in them, as well as being able to face the pain of the world and be impacted in a way that doesn't take me down either.
Yeah. So I was going to say about development that, whether we're working with a metaphor of a spiral that widens, or a spiral that widens and then narrows and then widens and then narrows, or whether we're thinking about other metaphors. I like the metaphor of juggling, which is the idea that every step in life, or every stage or phase or way of being or incarnation throughout life and longer stays in the mix. So the difference to me between what we could call pre-awakened and awakened consciousness would be that there's a moment where that which we are embedded in becomes sufficiently separate, or we become sufficiently separate that we can begin to integrate. And so this idea of coming to terms with sort of like being big enough, the preborn isn't big enough, maybe, we don't know, but big enough to cope with the reality of this historical moment. The child is contained within the primary matrix. The older child is really orienting very much within the boundary of family. And then we all are born and raised somewhere, and that context is going to define largely who we are, and we may not have the ability for many decades to really come to delineate what is me and what is in what ways am I just a product of my place and time. So there's something about all of those elements that come into play or reach a tipping point of ability to relate to that which is around me. And I can only do that if I'm not confused with it. And so to me, some of the stability of this idea of awakening comes from being able to continue in a more continual way, remember, even if I don't feel it, remember that that I am in relationship to, rather than submerged in whatever is happening. And so that shift to be in relationship, which makes possible encounter and makes possible openness, that's the shift as I see it. And of course it applies differently in different arenas as we look at, what that might mean in the traditions, the spiritual traditions, or in the psychological field, or in terms of how we relate to the body and, neurobiology, and then the social realm. So, but it's the same movement.
It's like the capacity to be knowing ourselves as the totality relaxes that grip on the self, so that we can start poking at, well, what's really going on here? And there's the self other, and then there's the self in the system, the self in the culture, self in the environment. And so, when I'm still in the process of, well, what do I mean by awakened activism? What's the definition? And thanks to you, Leticia, I've been refining it, and maybe I'll read that right now. I got it in my notes here. Awakened activism is action on behalf of the wellness of all beings, which is sourced in the love and trust arising from embodied realization of the unity or union with all of life. And then I add the second piece that, recognizing that developmental levels have significant impact on the effectiveness of our actions. Awakened activism becomes most fully expressed as psycho-spiritual, social, and environmental awakening mature in an individual. So, this piece of, there's the coming from the embedded and the habitual way of looking at the world to this macro view, and then from the macro relating, well, how do I relate to this amazing planet? How do I relate to the other people that I'm sharing this world with? And what's my part in the suffering? And like Kirstin was saying, then not getting crushed, like this ballast of the totality of being gives me this capacity to have my heart broken deeply without being annihilated. And that seems sort of important somehow too. What else does anybody want to say about awakening? What do we mean by awakening?
Well, one of the pieces that has been arising for me with awakening, especially within the context of the other, is how incredibly reliant my well-being and the well-being of all beings is on each other. In a way that I know that I had that at a rudimentary level of consciousness prior to awakening. And now I would say there is a level of subtlety and nuance to the degree to which I understand my my need of one another beyond survival. I think prior to this, I really looked at it more at a survival level. Like, I need the tree so that I will have oxygen. And that there's another level of my need for a tree now that is beyond familial even. I mean, that it comes into familial, but that there is a beyond reciprocity. There is an essentialness that of our connected existence that's hard to explain. Like the great appreciation of all life, as myself, as beyond myself, as the great mystery. And then the tenderness I have for it, and that my desire to be supportive and protective and connected is also amplified.
You're making me think about the idea of available surface area, like that. Awakening for me has to do with more surface area with which to experience everything. So more pain, more challenge, more sorrow, more, everything's considerably more, yet that expanded surface area that is available for to be in relatedness, to be in a kind of contact which permits presence. And when surface in the unawakened moments, even in so-called awakened life, or in the experience that is really bound by egoic, I guess in psychology we would call it egoic drives of survival and perceived survival, what's going on is the surface area is taken up with these I could say artificial or arbitrary, but sort of crusty aspects that must complete and then fall away. And so there's also this idea that awakening is, as we hear in, again, many traditions, the idea is closer to surrender, of course, than striving. But that surface area I find it to be a really, really helpful way. And, it's not a construction, a mental idea of, my being is bound with all things, or, my survival or my sense of self is connected. It's really much more than that, as you were poetically, beautifully describing.
Yeah, and then go ahead, Margit.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and then how that then informs activism, like how that changes my relationship to how I'm going to approach things, because that quality of presence, of being able to stay with myself and discern what right action is, rather than, like you were saying, from more of an egoic place, having 700 directions I'm being pulled, and a sense of desperation that then, of course, as I have experienced, leads to burnout, and is unsustainable. That there's another way of where, if I really deeply sit with my love of life, and then how is that calling me forward to be of service, to be connected, to offer my gifts, to support all of life.
I'm just sitting in the transmission of that. And that quality of surface area resonates for me. I remember part of my experience of the whole being realization of the non-separate embeddedness and the everything was I suddenly felt skinless. And that every square micrometer of the surface of my body was webbed into the web of life. And so, there's this quality of naked encounter that can, it takes a while getting used to it, for one, like navigating life, being that naked to the whole experience. And then later, now 5 years later, seeing how it's actually a sense organ. This is how my body, psyche, mind, spirit embedded in the totality is like a sense organ for the movement of being, for the movement of evolution. And so it's not I love this thing, not egoic drives. They do come up sometimes, and so then there's some reaction that needs to be integrated. That normally that's going to happen. But more and more, I have this feeling of just being webbed in and using my whole awareness to sense the totality and what needs to happen, what's my part in what needs to happen, or what wants to happen is a better word. Need has a lot of judgment, but what wants to happen? And how do I participate in the flow of what wants to happen, where my impulse is part of that unfolding? And my deep care and nakedness to the suffering and joy and beauty and the whole, the whole circus, the whole show is informed. My sensitivity to the whole informs that movement.
I'm thinking about how the references we've made to something being crushing or intolerable or impossible to deal with. I have a connection to that in two ways. One is the same thing that might in one moment, in an earlier perhaps moment, disorganize me, at another moment of development accelerates the beneficial impact of loss of that armor. So I think about there's this concept in the social field now of being woke, and I thought about how we might contrast awakening and wokeness. So woke is shorthand for people of all ages and orientations to the world to come to terms with the reality that everyone is embedded in a worldview and that there is unevenness and inequity built into all social systems, and to take a position in recognition of that lack of equity and that those dynamics of subtle or overt supremacy and oppression. And so wokeness is, to me, wokeness is noticing that there's dysfunction at levels beyond the personal and familial and even lowercase social to the more broad civilization, but awakening is a recognition that that's how it's supposed to be. Not in terms of desiring injustice or aligning with it, but a recognition of the way that fundamental humanity or being both infinite and finite, it's displays that woundedness or pathology displays differently at different levels of amplification. And to me, awakened activism has to do with the realization that the task at hand is not a fix. It's kind of a long way around to try to get to this point. That to me, wokeness is about the house is on fire, put the fire out. Let's do what needs to be done. Let's fix it. And awakened activism is a recognition of the invitation to engage deeply against and with the backdrop of inequality and injustice, without an attachment to the fix, but with attention and attunement to the transformation that condition makes possible. And this is difficult stuff to put into words, but I feel like that's, I don't know when we go to here, but that's what, Margit, you are working with so exquisitely, is the invitation to engage with this glorious, horrendous condition that is being human at the individual and collective levels. That's the invitation. And so awakened activism, as I've heard and seen you working with this idea, has to do with how in supported ways we can not just rise to the occasion, but kind of come to realize that this is the setup. You know?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I feel some tears. Something about being really willing to lean in without saddling myself with the savior complex or the martyr complex. It's leaning in fully with heartbreak and just, you know, from the awakened knowing, compassion is infinite. It's unbounded compassion. And there's nothing that escapes that compassion. And just seeing the whole history unfold and developmental movements and then some part of me knowing and trusting that every individual is doing the best they can. There's no question in my heart. You know, there might be some part of me that does this judgmental thing because it wants things to be different. But really, it's daring to love enough to respond. And love enough to see, to be willing to see.
Well, and with the judgment piece, it's not free of discernment. I mean, the awakening is not a blissed out state of equanimity with every mistreatment of all human beings. It's plenty rageful and discontented and disquieted. In fact, high levels of disquiet that are lined up right with that deep, restful peace. So these two things don't seem like they go together, but the deeper the peace, the more disquiet it can hold. And the more disquiet it can express. And so naming what is wrong and naming bad behavior, but much more so the conditions that permit broad dehumanization, that to me is part of awakened activism. It's just that its edge is not so vengeful. That's the piece that's different.
Yeah, there's tremendous courage and daring that comes online with this. The necessity to speak, the necessity to take a stand because of that well of heartbreak. Kirstin, I haven't heard from you. I'll make some room for you.
Oh, I for me, the way I experience it is trust, is this profound level of trust in life with a capital L. This sense of, I remember when I was a little girl, I don't even know how I came up with this, but I had this feeling that there was something about being a human person that made it impossible for me to see the big picture. That like I couldn't know it because I had the limitations of the human form. And that feels even more true to me now. And yet with awakening, there has been there's a tapping in on an almost alchemical kind of level of trusting what is. And through that trust being more affected, just as you said, Leticia, that piece about it's not that this is comfortable necessarily, But there's a simultaneous profound level of trust in the mix of it that is beyond my understanding.
Yeah, in preparation for this call and building the awakenedactivism.net website and some of the offerings, I find myself stumbling and feeling doubt. What am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. Is this going to make a difference? And so the way this trust that you speak of, Kirstin, kind of comes in, which is woven to the fierceness of taking a stand. It's like part of my practice is in the morning connecting with my commitment. What's my commitment? And my commitment is to be all in. And what that means is to be all in the material world as it is, and respond and participate, like in it, with it. And so I do that, and yet the outcome, there's no outcome that's in my hands. I have no control. So it becomes sacred activism in the sense that I feel for the impulse, I offer my action, and even as I offer the action, I let go of the outcome to the great unfolding mystery. And it's over and over. Okay, today I will do this and offer it into the great unfolding. And then the next breath, I offer that. And I get wound up and scared, and I do some integration. And then I sense for the next movement of being, and I offer that. And so it's a profound paradox of deep engagement and simultaneous surrender. And I can only do that because of that trust that you're talking about. And the engagement comes from that fierceness of being open to the heartbreak and what's happening in the dimension of matter.
Yeah, that's so well stated. I love that piece about how you offer and you don't have control. There's so much attempt to predict and control in the more commonly held worldview. I'm just so appreciating your surrender and my recognition of how much that is in my living this too. Not having control and offering what I offer to my clients and my students and to my life, my children and my relationships. And it's not in my hands, but listening to the impulse, trusting the broader holding.
And in the social, social justice realm, I think about the trust is a requirement for the so-called difficult or courageous conversations around race, gender, sexual orientation, these kinds of aspects, and also aspects around the ecological. So much fear rises behind all of those kinds of topics. So I'm thinking also about the trust that we have in the weave of being and every breath representing being a full ritual of that truth and that trust, and how the letting go of both the fix and the outcome, or the impulse to fix or the outcome, releases in the social aspect both our marginalized aspects and our advantaged aspects, because the biochemistry of our socialization and our relationship to those memberships, social memberships that carry either unearned advantage or unfair marginalization, the biochemistry of that is that it prohibits or at least reduces a regulation. And so this is where the spiritual is so absent, or however we want to think about this. Consciousness, attention to consciousness can be so absent. And it's absolutely necessary, because our biology, our biochemistry is going to go offline. So without access to awakened musculature, just to call it something, then ordinary socialization musculature will go in these predictable patterns, defendedness and vengefulness and reactivity. And so as you talk about trust, I think about in those moments when it really counts interpersonally or societally, or in terms of life decisions about what we're going to do about the water and the air, that this question of trust is really not just a beautiful idea. It's an absolute necessity, an ingredient required to be able to even engage a little bit. And when we use the word engagement, we mean full, like you were saying, Margit, all the way, committed engagement, fully present, which means that the part of me that just wants to fix it and put it out of my mind because I just don't want to deal with this whole concept of privilege or advantage or unfair advantage, that part becomes curious about the experience of people whose lives are affected by something that doesn't affect me. And or I become curious about the amazing capacity for the body and the planet to regenerate, not in an indefinite way, but that is a really true thing, and it feeds the trust. And on the side of where I may be really brewing with some terror and rage and anger, again, historically, intergenerationally, because of the psychic scream of all the beings worried about the possible end of this world, that also aligns me, that trust aligns me to be able to engage with the one who looks like the oppressor, the one who looks like they've got the key to the gate or the power. So these practices are so rich.
Yeah, and being able to see the oppressor in myself, like how I participate, willing to encounter, the shame that prevents me from sensing the other suffering of the other. And so that kind of brings me to this piece of mutuality. In the Trillium Path, we talk about mutuality and the willingness to listen to the other person's truth and the logic of their being and their experience. Like, awakening's great. And it also seems like it's important that, like, there's some quality of choice or willingness to really listen to the suffering. Yeah, we become naked and more, life becomes more colorful and more amplified and more sensitive. But, we've all seen awakened people whose shadows, there's a mountain behind them and they're causing all sorts of harm that they're not aware of, unconscious of. And so it's, part of awakened activism is what I say, self-responsibility, social responsibility, and environmental responsibility. It's like taking responsibility for our impact on others and choosing to listen to the suffering and really leaning into that. So that's a sort of musculature of awakening. And I don't know, I'm kind of mumbling now, but you get the gist.
Yeah, I feel really connected to that idea of even the people who are that I feel uncomfortable, that their experience leaves me feeling uncomfortable, or challenged in my own pain or in my own shadow, and the the gift of that. Coming to really see that all of my relationships and all of my encounters are also doorways to take me deeper into places I need to go.
I kind of want a poem. I'm feeling this is very full. We're coming toward the end of our time. Any last things you want to say? I'm going to grab my poetry folder. I'll be right back. Hold on.
I was looking for a poem also.
Did you find something?
I have one that I found that I really like.
Please.
And it's Bonaro Overstreet. And it's to one who doubts the worth of doing anything if you can't do everything. And this is the poem. You say the little efforts that I make will do no good. They never will prevail to tip the hovering scale where justice hangs in balance. I don't think I ever thought they would, but I am prejudiced beyond debate in favor of my right to choose which side shall feel the stubborn ounces of my weight.
Mm. Mm.
Thank you both for joining me today in this conversation. I feel enriched, encouraged, stretched, inspired, and deeply in love with both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Bye-bye. Thank you all for watching, and there's more to come on awakenedactivism.net and on my Awakened Activism YouTube channel. See you soon. Bye.